protection or control? Pick one. Because the moment Eric Carroll ended up with Timmy Whittaker away from the Whittaker household, while relatives say they never consented, the story stopped being emotional and became structural. Not how did it feel, not who sounded convincing, but who had the authority. That single moment split the public into two camps that still talk past each other. One side sees an emergency help move. The other sees something darker dressed up as help. And in 2026, we don't settle that argument with vibes. We settle it by separating what's documented from what's assumed. So hold the emotion for a moment, because this only makes sense if we slow it down. Ask yourself, and keep these questions in your head as we go. Who actually had the legal authority to take Timmy anywhere? Was there a court order, or just a claim? If it was truly for Timmy, why does the family say they were never asked? If there was no consent, what was it? A misunderstanding or control? And why did this moment happen in the middle of a money and content storm? Those questions are not accusations. They are filters. Because when vulnerable people become headlines, the system doesn't care who meant well. It cares who had the right to decide. What we can confirm right now. Start here. Because the internet loves a story, and vulnerable people pay the price when facts get buried under certainty. In 2026, there are several things we can verify without speculation. First, West Virginia State Police conducted an investigation into a donation and content operation tied to the Whittaker family. That investigation led to an arrest. On January 16, 2026, John Patrick Rourke was arrested and charged with multiple felony offenses, including exploitation of an incapacitated person and related fraud charges. According to the allegations summarized in public records, the case describes a pattern of using the Whittakers' disabilities, living conditions, and public sympathy to create monetized content, solicit money and merchandise, and route donations through channels the family could not meaningfully control. That matters for one specific reason. The clearest confirmed motive in the public record is financial. Not rescue, not guardianship, not a heroic intervention narrative. Financial exploitation. And tied to that same investigation, Eric Carroll is named in connection with the donation pipeline. Important distinction. Being named or identified in records is not the same thing as being charged. At the time reflected in the documents discussed publicly, Carroll was not charged. But being visible is not the same thing as being authorized. That difference is where everything starts to break. The moment everyone argues about. Now, we reach the painful core of this story. The moment that people keep fighting over instead of analyzing. The period when Timmy was away from the Whittaker household, while relatives say they did not give informed consent and did not know where he was. What is documented? Conflict, distress, an investigation. What is not clearly established in the materials we're using? A clean legal paper trail. Specifically, a court order granting Eric Carroll custody or placement authority. A guardianship order authorizing removal. A documented agency directive naming Carroll as a lawful caregiver. That absence does not automatically mean wrongdoing, but it does mean uncertainty. And in cases involving nonverbal, cognitively impaired adults, uncertainty is not neutral. It's dangerous, because without documentation, authority becomes assumed, and assumed authority is how control appears without announcing itself. Why 2026 forces a different lens. Here's what makes 2026 different from earlier years of this story. We now have a felony arrest tied to alleged exploitation, an active investigation involving donations and content, public requests from authorities for donors to provide transaction records, a vulnerable, nonverbal adult at the center of disputed consent. That combination changes the standard of proof. This is no longer a messy charity story. It is an alleged exploitation case. And once the state treats it that way, every action around a vulnerable person is evaluated through a harder lens. Not why did you do this, but who allowed you to do this. Presence is not permission. This is where the internet consistently gets it wrong. People see someone physically present and assume they're in charge. They see someone speaking confidently and assume they're authorized. They see someone helping and assume consent exists. But vulnerable adults are not protected by confidence. They are protected by consent, oversight, and law. Timmy is nonverbal. He cannot legally consent to relocation, filming, monetization, or separation from family. Any lawful decision about where he goes, who he sees, or who speaks for him must come from documented authority, not implication, not trust, not everyone knew. The question everyone skips. So strip away the emotion and ask the question the system would ask. If Eric Carroll had the legal authority to take Timmy away, where is the document? If he did not have that authority, what was the mechanism that allowed it to happen? Because those are the only two possibilities, and neither one can be resolved by arguing intentions. Why money and content matter here? This separation did not happen in a vacuum. It happened during a period when donations were flowing, content was being produced, public sympathy was being monetized. Outside organizers were acting as intermediaries. That context matters because money changes incentives. It does not prove motive, but it raises the stakes. When money, content, and vulnerable people intersect, the system becomes suspicious. This part does not accuse anyone of a crime. It does not claim intent. It does not assign motive. What it does is establish the framework that matters in 2026. Authority must be documented. Consent must be lawful. And vulnerable people cannot be moved, isolated, or monetized based on goodwill alone. That's the line. Where we go next. If you want to understand this without falling into rumor, the next step is not guessing motive. It's mapping time, because timelines don't argue back. That's where content turns into case, and that's where protection and control stop being opinions and start being questions that only documents can answer. Protection or control? One word, and why? If your understanding of this situation is built on clips, reactions, and arguments, then the most important part has already been missed. Because this story did not turn when someone spoke loudly. It turned when time, money, and authority crossed paths. So part 2 does one thing only. It rebuilds the timeline that actually matters, not to prove a narrative, but to show where certainty ends and questions begin. No speculation, no motive assignment, just structure, the compression problem. One reason this case feels impossible to talk about online is because months of events are being mentally compressed into one dramatic moment. People remember, Timmy was taken, the family was upset, there was money, someone got arrested. All of that is true, but not all at once. When you collapse the timeline, you erase the turning points. And those turning points are where consent either existed or disappeared. So let's slow it down. Phase 1. Visibility without structure. Before the system stepped in, the Whittaker family existed in a strange public-private limbo. They were vulnerable, they were isolated, and they were visible. Content creators, helpers, and intermediaries began filling gaps that institutions hadn't yet formalized. That included filming, donation coordination, merchandise, communication with the public. At this stage, authority was informal. People acted because no one else clearly was. This is where good intentions often live, and where the risk quietly starts. Phase 2. The investigation opens. September 2025. This is the first documented inflection point. In September 2025, a months-long investigation into donation activity and exploitation concerns begins. That investigation would later be publicly confirmed by West Virginia State Police. This matters because once an investigation opens, the environment changes even if the public doesn't yet know it. Agencies begin watching. Money flows. Access patterns. Who is acting as a gatekeeper? Who controls communication? At this stage, the public still thinks it's drama. The system does not. Phase 3. Adult Protective Services intervene. During this same general period, late 2025, Adult Protective Services intervene. Multiple family members, including Timmy Whittaker, are removed from the home. Two crucial things happen here that the internet almost always misunderstands. First, placement details are kept confidential by design. Agencies do not publicly announce where vulnerable adults are taken or who is with them. Second, this creates an information vacuum. And vacuums do something predictable. They get filled by intermediaries. People who already have access, communication channels, or public platforms suddenly become the bridge between the family and the outside world. Not necessarily by design, but by default. This is where authority can quietly shift. Phase 4. The separation becomes visible. At some point after the removals, Timmy is no longer seen at the Whittaker property. Family-aligned voices express distress. They say they were not asked. They say they did not consent. They say they did not know where Timmy was or who had him. This is the moment that triggers the public split. But here's what matters. Visibility of separation is not the same thing as documentation of authority. What we have at this stage: family distress reported. Timmy away from the household observed. Eric Carroll spending significant time with Timmy reported/observed. What we do not have in the materials discussed publicly: a quoted court order granting Carroll custody, a guardianship filing naming him as decision-maker, an agency document authorizing removal or placement with him. That absence is not proof of wrongdoing, but it is the reason the question exists. Phase 5. The money trail hardens. Late 2025, January 2026. While the separation debate is happening online, something else is happening quietly. The investigation tightens around money. Authorities begin focusing not on personalities, but on donation routing, account control, merchandise sales, who had access to funds, who could decide how money was used. This is where the story shifts from who helped to who benefited. And this is why 2026 looks so different from earlier years. Phase 6. Arrest and charges. January 16, 2026. On January 16, 2026, John Patrick Rourke is arrested. He faces multiple felony charges, including exploitation of an incapacitated person, fraudulent schemes tied to donations. The allegations describe a pattern of monetizing the Whittakers' vulnerability through content and donation pipelines the family could not meaningfully control. This is the first moment the state speaks loudly. And when the state speaks this way, everything before it gets reevaluated. Not emotionally, procedurally. Phase 7 names, not charges. In connection with the same investigation, Eric Carroll is identified by name in relation to the donation pipeline. Important distinction again. Named is not equal to charged. Identified is not equal to convicted. But identification changes scrutiny. Once someone is identified in an exploitation investigation, the system begins asking very specific questions about access, and that distinction matters. Because when documents are sealed or not yet produced, the internet tries to turn silence into certainty. That's how people get hurt. Why the timing raises real questions. Here's the part people feel, but can't articulate. The separation happened during an investigation, a donation surge, a content cycle, an authority vacuum. That timing does not prove intent, but it raises a legitimate governance question. Who was supposed to be in charge of Timmy at that moment? If the answer is a court, a guardian, an agency, then where is the record? If the answer is no one clearly, then the system failed, not a person. And when systems fail, individuals often step in without realizing they're crossing lines. Why this is not about why would someone do that? Online debate keeps asking why. Why would he take Timmy? Why would the family lie? Why would anyone do this? But the system doesn't ask why first. It asks how. How was authority established? How was consent obtained? How was accountability enforced? If those answers are unclear, motive becomes secondary. The dangerous middle truth. Here is the hardest possibility to sit with, that Timmy's separation may have occurred in a space where agencies were acting, families were confused, intermediaries were filling gaps, and authority was assumed rather than documented. That does not require villains. It requires ambiguity, and ambiguity is the one thing vulnerable people cannot afford. Where this leaves us. So after part 2, here's where we stand. We have a documented investigation. We have a documented arrest. We have a documented exploitation allegation. We have a documented separation. What we do not yet have is the single document that resolves the core question. Who had the legal right to decide where Timmy could be? Until that appears, no one gets to declare protection or control as fact, only as risk, because in 2026, conclusions don't come from confidence. They come from paperwork. This is the point where most coverage collapses into verdicts. We're not doing that, because when the paperwork isn't public, the only responsible way to think is to map plausible explanations, identify what evidence would be required to confirm each one, and stop pretending certainty exists where it doesn't. That's what this part does. Not what happened, not who is guilty, but what could realistically explain Timmy's separation, and what proof would have to exist for each explanation to hold. No motives assigned, no accusations beyond the record, just structure. The ground rules, before we lay out the decision tree, for constraints matter. Timmy Whittaker is nonverbal and cognitively impaired. He cannot legally consent to relocation, filming, or monetization. Any lawful decision must come from documented authority. Eric Carroll has been publicly identified in connection with the donation pipeline, but was not charged in the materials discussed to date. Identification is not equal to guilt. Adult Protective Services placements are often confidential. Absence of public paperwork is not proof that paperwork doesn't exist, but it does mean the public cannot assume authority. An active exploitation investigation reframes everything. Once that line is crossed, claims of help are tested against receipts, access, and control. With those constraints in place, here are the realistic explanations and the evidence each would require. Branch A. Misguided help framed as protection. What this means: someone genuinely believed removing Timmy from the family environment was necessary for his safety, care, or stability. This explanation does not require bad intent. It requires a belief, right or wrong, that intervention was protective. What would support this explanation? A court order, agency placement directive, or written authorization specifying where Timmy was to be placed. Documentation of medical necessity, e.g. appointments, evaluations, emergency placement notes. Records showing temporary transport with agency knowledge, dates, times, destinations. Communications indicating the family was informed by an authorized party, even if late or imperfectly. What is confirmed versus unknown? Confirmed: an investigation into exploitation, APS involvement, Timmy's removal from the household. Unknown: any document explicitly authorizing Carroll to take or keep Timmy, any court-issued placement naming him. Key test: if protection was the basis, where is the authorization that survives scrutiny? Protection in 2026 is procedural, not personal. Branch B. Control through isolation, risk pattern, not a verdict. What this means: Timmy's separation functioned, intentionally or not, to limit family access, shape information flow, or consolidate influence over his environment. This is a risk pattern, not a finding. It becomes relevant only if evidence supports it. What would support this explanation? Messages or records showing restricted contact with family without agency direction. Evidence of blocking, gatekeeping, or conditions placed on access not ordered by a court. Statements indicating exclusive decision-making about Timmy's movements or visibility. Lack of any agency or court document authorizing isolation. What is confirmed versus unknown? Confirmed: family-aligned reports of distress and lack of consent. Unknown: any official finding that isolation was intended or directed, any order limiting family contact. Key test: isolation becomes control when access is restricted without lawful authority. The document trail decides this, not tone. Branch C. Image management and narrative control. What this means: Timmy's environment was managed to produce cleaner, more controllable content, or to reduce. Branch D. Authority confusion and informal permission. What this means: someone believed they had permission through informal agreements, implied consent, or "I'm helping, so it's allowed," without realizing that vulnerability changes the consent standard. This is common. It's also dangerous. What would support this explanation? Messages suggesting assumed consent. They were okay with it. We discussed it. Absence of any formal authorization despite ongoing involvement. Evidence of good faith actions paired with missing paperwork. What is confirmed versus unknown? Confirmed: Timmy cannot legally consent. Any authority must be documented. Unknown: whether any guardian, court, or agency explicitly granted authority elsewhere. Key test. In 2026, implied permission does not survive incapacity. Only documented authority does. Branch E. Practical logistics later contested. What this means: short-term transport for appointments, services, or temporary care expanded into a longer separation when communication broke down. This explanation assumes no plan, only drift. What would support this explanation? Verified appointment schedules, transport logs, or service referrals. Witness corroboration placing Timmy at specific locations for specific reasons. Evidence showing temporary intent that later hardened into separation. What is confirmed versus unknown? Confirmed. APS involvement. Confidentiality around placements. Unknown. Any corroborated logistics trail explaining duration and authority. Key test. Logistics become a problem when temporary actions lack an exit plan and authority is never clarified. What the decision tree tells us. So far, none of these explanations can be ruled in or out without documents. That's the point. And that's why arguments online keep recycling the same phrases. They're trying to substitute certainty for paperwork. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Motive is not a vibe. Motive is a document. Until a court order, guardianship filing, or agency directive appears that clearly assigns authority over Timmy's placement, every explanation remains provisional. Why 2026 changes the burden. Before the arrest and exploitation allegations, ambiguity lived longer. After them, it doesn't. Once exploitation of incapacitated people is alleged, every access decision is retroactively reviewed against authority, benefit, and control. That's not punishment. It's due diligence. And it's why this decision tree matters. It shows what evidence would end the argument. The one evidence type that resolves everything. There is a single category of proof that would collapse the debate immediately. A court-issued order, guardianship, placement, or protective, naming who could decide where Timmy goes. If it exists, protection likely had a lawful basis. If it doesn't, control, intentional or not, becomes a live risk. Everything else is secondary. Where this leaves us, at the end of Part 3, the responsible position is not a conclusion. It's a watch posture. We watch for court filings, agency statements tied to policy, donation records that clarify who controlled funds, any document that clarifies authority at the moment Timmy was separated. Until then, the question remains open, not because truth is hidden, but because authority has not been proven. This is where the story stops being about interpretation and starts being about consequence. Because whatever Timmy's separation was at the beginning, protection, confusion, control, logistics, or some mix of all four, the aftermath tells us how the system ultimately categorized the risk. And in 2026, the system spoke clearly, not emotionally, procedurally. So Part 4 is not about origins. It's about what changed after, and why those changes matter more than any argument about intent. The first shift, legal gravity, replaces narrative gravity. Before January 2026, the loudest voices in this story were online. After January 16th, 2026, the loudest voice became the state. When John Patrick Rourke was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including exploitation of an incapacitated person and related fraud, the entire frame changed. This was no longer treated as messy charity drama, influencer conflict, misunderstandings around help. It was treated as alleged financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. That classification matters because it triggers a different institutional posture. Once exploitation charges enter the record, agencies stop asking, "Who seems trustworthy?" They start asking, "Who had access? Who had control? Who benefited?" And they ask those questions retroactively. The second shift, the donation pipeline becomes evidence. One of the most telling moves by authorities was not the arrest itself. It was what came next. Law enforcement publicly asked anyone who had sent money or merchandise through John Patrick Rourke or through Eric Carroll on behalf of the Whittaker family to come forward with transaction records. That request is not casual. It signals that investigators are mapping where money originated, who controlled accounts, who could redirect funds, who made decisions about use. This matters for the Timmy question because money and access are inseparable in exploitation cases. When someone controls donations, they often control communication, visibility, movement, narrative. Not always by intent, but by leverage. And once leverage exists, consent becomes suspect and less documented. The third shift, silence, replaces visibility. After the arrest, something else happened that people often misinterpret. The story went quieter, not because nothing was happening, but because agencies pulled the curtain. Protective services and law enforcement do not litigate active cases in public. Once a case is active, information narrows. Placements become confidential. Access becomes restricted. Statements become measured. This silence frustrates the internet, but legally it's protective, especially for a nonverbal, cognitively impaired adult like Timmy Whittaker. Silence here is not indifference. It's containment. The fourth shift, the risk lens hardens. This is the change most people miss. After the arrest and donor outreach, the system no longer evaluates actions based on how they were described. It evaluates them based on risk patterns. And risk patterns include undocumented authority, exclusive access, money control, isolation from family, content monetization tied to vulnerability. None of these individually prove wrongdoing, but together they justify restriction. So even if Timmy's separation began with good intentions, the aftermath reframes it. The question becomes, did this arrangement increase or decrease exploitation risk? And if the answer is unclear, the system defaults to restriction, not because it knows what happened, but because it knows what could happen. The fifth shift, the family's distress takes legal weight. Early on, family distress was treated by some as emotional noise. In 2026, it isn't. When relatives state they were not informed, did not consent, and did not know where a vulnerable family member was, that becomes a data point, not a feeling, especially when paired with a financial exploitation investigation, a nonverbal adult, outside intermediaries controlling communication. Family distress does not decide guilt, but it does trigger scrutiny, because one of the core safeguards for incapacitated adults is family involvement, unless a court says otherwise. When family access is disrupted without clear documentation, agencies ask why. The sixth shift, intent becomes irrelevant. This is the hardest truth of the aftermath. Once the system moves in, intent stops being central. The law does not ask, "Did you mean well?" It asks, Did you have the authority? Did you follow protocol? Did this arrangement expose a vulnerable person to harm? That's why debates about character and sincerity stop mattering, because even perfect intentions cannot override missing paperwork. What the aftermath suggests. Without accusing anyone, we have to be precise here. The aftermath does not prove that Timmy was taken for profit, that separation was malicious, that Eric Carroll committed a crime. What it does suggest is this. The system ultimately treated the situation as high risk enough to pursue felony exploitation charges against Rourke, trace donation paths involving Carroll, restrict information, tighten access around the family. Those actions are not taken lightly. They reflect a judgment that ambiguity itself was dangerous. Why this matters more than the origin story. People want to know how this started. The system wants to know how it ends, because prevention is forward-facing. From the system's perspective, the most important question is not, who was right?